I'm Alfonso Winker.
And I'm Trina Olson. And together, we're the co-founders of Team Dynamics.
And this is Behave.
Welcome back to Behave. We are so glad to be with everybody today. Alfonso, I have been having an inkling about what I think is a reoccurring hot topic in the workplace. So if you are amenable, can we please spend today's episode talking about time?
I would love nothing more than to talk about time because I think about time a lot.
Yes. Oh, that's true. I've been around you when you point out to me the exact minutes or seconds we're at. That's true. I've been thinking about time because I've been timing some of our small group facilitation so that when people go into small groups, I have time to preheat my oven. And then at the next small groups, I can bake 3 cookies. I have it timed out like very particularly. I've got a 10-minute preheat and then I have an 11-minute cookie bake. That's what I've got.
Oh my gosh. Mine's usually like a water and a Diet Coke or like a pistachio.
Sure. Sure. Okay. So there's a lot of reasons why I want to talk about time, and I'm certain we can't get into every facet of it today, but it's rearing up in conversation again in a way that I think is really relevant to equity, racism, identity, and our lived experiences and expectations of each other, both spoken and assumed. So there's a couple layers I think we can get to today, which is talking about how for a whole lot of us, in the workplace, time is very relevant because we're trying to get a lot done, right? There's a lot of research that shows that in the US, we work a lot of hours that isn't directly representational of our productivity, output, or creativity, but we have a sense of just the amount of time we spend attempting to do work. And a lot of us have really strong feelings that feel almost visceral or physical when we think about our boundaries around time, what feels good, what feels bad, what our preferences are, and a lot of sort of confusion, misunderstanding, and judgment when our colleagues relate to time differently than we do. We think a lot about in the workplace about how time may or may not be related to folks' attempts to show respect of each other or of the work they're trying to do. And you and I have had a bunch of conversations about how our relationships to time as professionals has evolved over time and what is now in our awareness about where did we even learn this? Because our relationships to time aren't as simple as our personalities or our proclivities or folks calling me a late, early, or on-time person. So no matter what anybody's said about me, I have my own memories of how I've been trained or taught and also what I've pushed against as it relates to time. Does that sound like an okay map for our convo?
Yeah, I'm excited about it. And I think something that I'm ready to weave in is a conversation we've had a lot before on Behave and in other works, is the idea of a dominant culture in workplaces being reinforced, meaning depending on what your behavior or relationship to time is, there's praise or punishment for how you behave or relate to or perform time.
Yeah, and I think time is one of those things that seems almost innocuous, or I've heard folks infer or say explicitly, well, we can all agree we should start this meeting on time. Or it's important that we end on time. Or here is how I felt about that candidate for this job because of when they logged into the meeting or showed up in our lobby. So it's ever present, but at the same time, it's not negotiated that often.
I mean, even as you were saying on time, I sort of had this flinch because I started to think about, I know inside of team dynamics, we have a bunch of agreements about what on time looks like. And I've had a lot of experiences in the workplace where the leader of the meeting or the most in charge person in the room is saying, well, we want to start this meeting on time or we want to begin this conversation on time as an indirect way to suggest we're not beginning at the time they had imagined we would begin as they look at the clock and sort of project their own preferences around clock time.
Yeah. And will you share with our listeners what do you feel like are the hallmarks of your current relationship to how you prefer to connect to, relate to time when you're working?
Yes. So I think that in me is a pretty strong commitment to clock time, meaning I spend a lot of my day looking at the clock. I don't always love that. I think it takes a lot of energy. I think it means I'm subscribing to someone else's idea of productivity or professionalism. And it can also be sort of soothing or helpful to me because I just know where I'm at. So I think I'm pretty tied to or pretty focused on the time it is on the clock, in particular, ending at a time that people were told they were going to end is probably one of the most important things I try to practice in a day.
Absolutely. That's how I've experienced you. And I bet a lot of our listeners can really resonate with having that experience at work.
Yeah, like
Um,
I'm definitely that person in a meeting when there's like 7 minutes left. I'm saying things like, so I know we're coming up on time, which really I think when I say that, I mean there isn't time for anybody to have a new idea or thought. So we should finish. Don't begin anything else.
yeah, you flag with time a lot. Yeah. So you're saying, okay, let's all remember we've committed to 6 minutes left, 10 minutes left. In that 10 minutes, how reasonable are we about our expectations about what we can accomplish? Or would it be responsible or irresponsible to open up a whole new topic to have to interrupt it at the end? So, yeah, you flag with time on regularly.
Right. And I know that time is something we've negotiated because we have sort of distinct, I wouldn't say disparate, but we have distinct ways that we manage time.
Yeah. And I think part of that is because you and I try to be really clear with each other on a quarterly basis how we're trying to focus given our roles related to our company. So sometimes we have projects that last multiple quarters or even multiple years, but sometimes either you or I have a project, a client, something we're writing where we get conscious about what we need to focus on. And then we kind of renegotiate and say, okay, well, I'm doing a bunch of creative work and I'm building this thing. I'm going to make my very best guess about how long it takes, but I'm certain that's not going to be totally accurate, right? Maybe it's going to take 45 minutes. Maybe it's going to take 3 hours. Maybe it's going to take 2 days. Maybe it's going to take a day and a half. Like, I really don't know because I have to get started. Right. And then there's other things that we can really predict because we have tight agendas that we have a lot of practice at. So we have a sense of how long that conversation will take or how long a meeting will take now that our team keeps growing. Right. So you and I regularly talk about that too of, hey, if we have this many humans in a room, it's actually irresponsible to pretend we're going to get this done in a half an hour because the people wouldn't even all have had time to say hello.
Right.
Right. And so we have to navigate that a lot. And so I think you're right. We talk about the difference between the flexibility and the wiggle room on time when we're doing internal stuff and when we're doing external stuff, when we are doing presentations and coaching, and when we're doing like brainstorming meetings or needing to have complex conversations to make a decision. So we also try to say, okay, does this conversation need to come to a satisfactory conclusion? And we're not quite sure how long that's going to be. So have we created our schedule such that we have any wiggle room or no? Right? Maybe I have a meeting right after this meeting. Maybe you don't. So you do have more time, right? So this idea too of being in constant conversation about what do you need? What do I need? And how might that be similar or different? And then how do we come to an agreement that doesn't feel like we're both compromising, meaning we're just getting a lower or medium or middle quality, but okay, how do we need to split this task up or this conversation up so we really have a high quality output and we learn from it based on how much time it takes?
And if you're listening, as Trina just sort of came at time, task, creativity, creating relationship from a bunch of different angles, you might be thinking that sounds laborious or tedious or like you're overdoing time. So that we don't make it implicit, Trina, will you talk about why we think about time, task, relationship, creativity being generative from so many different angles? Because I think it could be easy for someone to just think like, why are you two making it harder than it needs to be?
Yeah, thanks for asking for that. So a couple things. We'll see which order this comes out. So I don't have to do as much negotiation around time when it's just tasks I'm responsible for completing alone. I have to communicate to other people because Babis creates my schedule. I have other, off calendar appointments to have a phone call with my niece or to go to the chiropractor, right? I have time commitments. But when I'm just working on my tasks, it kind of doesn't matter that much if nobody else is being impacted by how I'm spending my time. And I have found for me that there is tremendous value in navigating, negotiating, and talking about time together when I'm in collaboration with my colleagues. And that might mean we're working on a project together or we're sort of in a relay race of tasks. Like I need to finish something before I hand it to Alexa, then Alexa hands it to Levi, right? So no matter what, whether collaboration literally means we're doing something at the same time or it is that we are part of a project together, here's what I deeply believe because it's my lived experience. I am smarter and made smarter because I'm working with y'all. And so the idea that I don't want to give short shrift to the working relationship, and I have no idea based on your day, your week, your health, your concentration level, what you need in order to participate. And so that idea that we were all raised by different people in different households across different times and across different places on the planet. And so for me, doing the work that eventually becomes sort of a time shorthand is so worth it because if we don't, we end up missing each other. We end up doing incomplete work. Things end up being inefficient because we actually then have to reschedule stuff or add meetings or add, 7 more email responses. I would rather do the upfront work to say, okay, based on your relationship to this task and project, my relationship to this task and project, you know yourself best. What are you going to need to do it? Then it means above the waterline of that cultural iceberg, we're able to get honest with each other about what's going to be required so that we're not pretending that we can do something we can't, and so that we are getting the best out of everybody. Because again, I am not interested in speed over quality, and I'm not interested in quantity over quality. We want to produce impeccable, high quality work. And so what will it take to do that? We got to talk about it or we're not going to know. So we'll go to break and we'll come back with some more tips and tricks for having this conversation about time.
Welcome back. Let's weave in, Trina, aspects of identity. So we've really been talking about culture, which is behaviors and pattern and sort of how we think about and value and understand time. And the thing that we know is in every single workplace, there are preferences toward and away from various identity groups. It's predictable in US workplace culture that the preferences are toward whiteness and masculinity. Part of the constructs of whiteness is relative to the link between whiteness and time and work has a lot to do with the idea that as workers, we're supposed to be producing a lot in an 8-hour workday, right? From the Industrial Revolution, from mining and manufacturing, that during a period of time, your value is relative to how you spent that time and what you generated during that time. And in order to undo that sort of pressure to produce or have high output, we first have to get close to our sort of concepts and understanding of time and realize that some people are getting praised for their output or what they're producing or how they are, quote, effectively spending their time. And then other people are getting punished for how they're spending their time because, like you were saying, Trina, we're putting quantity over quality. We're putting speed over creativity. We're saying we're forgetting to be in broad and open conversation about given who's around the table, the money that we have, the goals that we have, how much time and attention does this particular project or product or process say? So we just start to arbitrarily think in 30 and 60 and 75 and 90-minute increments without linking it to a particular creative goal that we have. And then people that can assimilate to sort of a white dominant culture of, quote, on time, then get praised, they get promoted, they get paid more because the measure of their value isn't about the contribution that they bring to the team. The measure of their value that ends up becoming, are you really good at watching a clock? And are you really good at generating a lot while
Right.
you're watching the clock?
Right. And are those the most important measures of success? Are they measures of success at all based on what you're doing, and where in the priority order should they fit? Earlier today, we were talking with some clients about a book that we have found really valuable called Riding the Waves of Culture. And we were talking about some of the dynamics and polarities of cultural communities that really value rules, or cultural communities that really value relationships. And then we were talking about cultural communities that love polychronic time and cultural communities that love synchronic time. So that's a long way of saying on our team at Team Dynamics, we have staff, colleagues, friends who have been raised in the contiguous United States, some who have been raised on an island, some who have been raised in South America. We have folks who are part of indigenous cultural communities, religious cultural communities. We have folks who are Jewish and Christian. We have folks across an age span. So the idea that time is neutral is only true if we don't get really judgy and hierarchical about how other people relate to time, right? So this idea that if you think about ever watching movies, reading books, or experiencing what it's like for different faith communities to have wildly different lengths of a faith service, right? Or we think about who gets excited and who dreads when a professional sports game goes long or goes into sort of extra time, and who gets nervous or excited if a keynote speaker at a work conference really gets in their flow and talks until they've finished making a point. And maybe they went 7, 10, 15 minutes over what was on the paper schedule. So what? Now what? So I'm curious for you, Alfonso, what are you still wrestling with when it comes to describing to people you're in work relationship with how they can show you respect with time, and what you're working on to try to be flexible or adaptive in order to adjust to the reality that we all relate to time differently?
So I am a bullet point kind of person or a list kind of person. And I am wrestling with when I'm not leading a meeting and I haven't been given a list, knowing that something creative or interesting or helpful can emerge when so much structure isn't given to the conversation. When a sort of generative or relational orientation is present versus a task orientation. So I know I'm wrestling with not overemphasizing task list as signal of value. So knowing that I have ways that I run meetings, and that when I'm feeling sort of untethered, a lot of that has to do with a desire for control.
Mm,
And so I know that when I'm running a version of a meeting that is sort of timed out and on paper and is like a 1, 2, 3 ABC in an order bullet list, that might also feel like lack of control for people that may want to be more expansive or generative. So I'm noticing that I decide things are all the way a way or not a way versus what does this topic or question need in terms
mm.
of length, in terms of structure. I'm not always the correct person that I for leading conversation.
Yeah, that really, it's bringing back a very strong memory for me that in 2009, in a workplace setting. So I, at the time, was working for a national organization that had 8 different offices around the United States. And we were in the middle of 2 departments merging together. It was strategically really smart based on what we were up against or what was coming next to sort of find a better way to organize our top talent, right? So I was part of one of the departments that was getting merged. And I had the good fortune of being part of that process with one of my friends and movement colleagues, Reverend Dr. Rebecca Vocal. She didn't invent this phrase, but she was the first one who taught it to me. We were talking about the difference between focusing on being timely and timeful. And I was like, lady, what are you even talking about? Right? Because at the time, I was really in a role where I had to create and produce a high volume of output every day. And so I was fixated on timely. I was fixated on a start time, on an end time, on how much we could get done in between time. And Rebecca's work was really relational organizing. And we spent months talking together about, well, it's disrespectful to not show up to a meeting on time. And she was like, okay, well, let me, posit this scenario. What if I'm in the middle of a conversation with somebody, they're sharing something important, and I cut them off? Isn't that disrespectful? Just to be on time. So I got myself sort of in this mental gymnastics of, is it more important to be respectful of the person in front of you that you happen to be talking to or the person you're about to talk to? And how do I sort of plan my schedule that way? And so I'm a person who was raised in a household where 15 minutes early was on time, right? So it was important. We would rather sit in a cold car in Minnesota early than run the risk of running into something on the road, being late, right? And I've done almost a full 180 around my relationship to time. So I'm somebody who really prefers wiggle room, and I have no interest in ending a vibrant conversation because it happens to be 30 past or 15 past. So it means I've had to adjust my calendar. And I also have some protocols, whether it's Slack or text, to let people know, hey, I'm going to be a little bit late. And it's my responsibility to catch up on the part of the meeting that I missed, right? So it's not about moving to a time free for all. But for me, it was learning and recognizing, oh, I've been taught that the most important thing is the clock. Maybe the most important thing is people, and the clock is a tool we can use in order to find each other and make time to talk to each other. So for me, I think it's like I've got a foot in both camps, because there's stuff I get really itchy about between early, late, and on time. But I've found that as I'm getting older and as I'm working with certain people, I'm much more lax about time, and I actually get pretty frustrated when people aren't. So I've also noticed, even as I've shifted my perspective, now I'm just judgmental about time in a different way. So it's not like I'm getting easier about it, but I know my relationship to it.
So let's take a break. And then when we come back, we can talk about how folks would negotiate or explore some protocols around time that pays attention to identity and positional power.
Why can't you behave?
Welcome back. So as per usual on Behave, we're always really happy to share what we're trying. It is not as though we are finished experimenting, but we are really committed to being in a spirit of experimentation. So as I weave in race and gender to my work and my reactions, one of the things I recognize, right, is that I work on a team with a lot of people of color. I work on a team of people from different cultural backgrounds. And so as we think about how to navigate and create an environment where we've got options, the first set of protocols that we really developed at Team Dynamics was to revisit and just build a quick check-in of, okay, hey, we had 45 minutes planned for this based on where you're at and where I'm at. Is that still feeling realistic? What do you think about that? Do you have something right after this? Do you have any flex, or do you have a hard stop? Right? That took me, 7 seconds to say. So part of what we talk about whenever we teach new patterns or we give offerings or invitations is that it might be different, new, or even feel a little funny to do that at the beginning of every collaborative opportunity. But again, we have learned by just taking less than 30 seconds to do a time check-in rather than just assume that we're going to stick to something that got put on our calendar maybe 6 weeks ago, right? We've just built in a time check and we check on those kind of things. Hey, if we're really clear about the goal of this conversation or collaboration, this is the time that I have. What's the time you have? What's going to work for us? And to remember, right, I am a white person and I'm the CEO of our organization. So I have positional power. It is important that I don't just ask everybody to do what works best for me on my timeline. That's not my approach to equity because that's not going to set everybody else up for success. So I do have to get cognizant of where I have preferences and where those are really important on a given day and where I have preferences. But in fact, I could be really flexible if I tried.
Something that I want to sort of tease out or illuminate is the ability to fairly swiftly, I don't want to say fast, but fairly swiftly do some negotiation and checking in way upstream before anyone's feeling frustrated or out of control or like their approach to time isn't being respected, right? Because part of what happens is then in an organization, in a workplace, in your workplace, as you're listening, we're having this rumble about time. We're talking about people being on time or late. And what happens is we default to dominant culture. So then when we're in that rumble, when we're in that sort of crunchy spot of, oh, we don't have shared meaning around time, the expeditious way to mitigate that problem is often through defaulting to dominant culture, like you're saying, right? So how can we, when we're not in some sort of crickly way, that's my official scientific word for it, around how we're perceiving and experiencing the time we share, how can we name, here's what I know about my identity, my position, and my preferences. This is what it looks like we're going to be up to. How's that landing for everybody, right?
And I appreciate, because we work together in a lot of different facets, right? Sometimes we do public speaking together. Sometimes we're building out curriculum together. Sometimes we're working on the budget together. I appreciate that whether it's getting ready to go to brunch or it's getting ready to build a budget, you're really clear that you're not the exact same in every sort of container, right? You are not a person that is interested in being rushed through a meal. Me neither, thank God. But that idea that we don't have to hold so tightly to either who we've been told we are or this limiting belief that we can only behave one sort of way. So for example, clock time is not my preference. And depending on the goal and the relationships, I can abide by clock time, right? When I think about the difference between the time I want to take getting ready for church, getting ready for a date, and getting ready for a training, it's like, oh, I have a different relationship to sort of the on-ramp that I want or my expectations. And so the fact that we get to keep checking in and saying, okay, what's going to work for you? Or like, I know if I come to your house early for brunch, what that means is I'm going to do some cleaning because you're finishing setting food up, right? Or you might still be working on your face or your hair. And so it's like, okay, great. You can come at clock time, but like, I think people are going to really roll in at about 40 minutes past when I send out, the invitation. So that idea again, that one size does not fit all when it comes to time. And if we can remember that, we can navigate and negotiate that time is merely a commodity that we can utilize well or not. And it can be part of what's important, but it is very unlikely that it's the thing that is most important.
And while at first pass, time might seem trivial, or you might think, well, we're all in agreement about time. As soon as you start feeling really certain about how time works in your workplace, on your team, it's probably time to check in and start asking some questions about how people are experiencing time management, timeliness, timefulness, as Trina was talking about, because it's likely that if we're coasting, we're in deference to the dominant culture. We're reinforcing whiteness and masculinity because those are the identities that are preferred and in leadership and have shaped and formed so many of our workplaces.
Well, thanks for being willing to have that conversation today. Time does feel like a hot topic that we're going to keep coming back to because as folks increasingly tell us they really do desire to be in mixed workplaces, mixed across race, mixed across class, mixed across age, sexual orientation, we are going to come with our different patterns and preferences as it relates to time. So it's something that we can negotiate or we can sort of trip around the edges. And so the invitation is to get into it. And the first way to get into it is to think and do some self-reflection. What do I want when I think about bringing my best work and being of value in this collaboration? Okay, now how can I ask better questions about what my colleagues might want? And how can we get creative about how we best use our time together?
Thanks for hanging out. We always want to hear from you. You can tweet us at Behave Podcast and tell us, how are you navigating and negotiating culture, identity, and time? Be sure to wash your hands, wear a mask, and make good choices.
Loosen up a little. Is that helpful?
Loosen up my buttons like a
I knew you were
pussycat
going to
doll.
say it. I knew you were going to say it. I knew it the second you said it.